talk about web forms, a little bit about today, and but mostly about tomorrow, about what we're bringing to web forms in the next version. And to convince you, in case you had any doubt, that web forms is most certainly not dead, and we still care very, very much about it. I am Damien Edwards. I'm a program manager on the ASP.NET team, and I look after two areas. One of them is web forms, and the other is our jQuery and Ajax story as well, which I'm going to be talking about tomorrow, if you're interested in that. So let's start out by just setting the level nice and straight in terms of what the current state of web forms is. And as I said, it is most definitely not dead. The fact is that the vast majority of our customers still use web forms today. And while we might talk a lot about ASP.NET MVC, and then in certain arenas we'll talk about web pages as well, our much newer, simpler framework and syntax with the Razor syntax for building the script-like pages, web forms are still the predominant technology used by the vast majority of our customers, well over 80%. The ecosystem is still very, very much alive around web forms as well. And it's worth remembering that 4.0 was only released just over 12 months ago. It was last April that Visual Studio 2010 and .NET 4 came out. And we shipped a whole lot of great stuff in web forms version 4. Who's using version 4 today? Okay, quite a lot of you. That's great. And I hope you're getting, enjoying or getting some of the benefit out of using the stuff that we put in version 4. But with that, I wanted to sort of just refresh on a couple of things that perhaps you weren't aware of or maybe you're not using yet. So let's just jump into some code very, very quickly right up front. I wanted to have a quick look at routing. So we added support for routing in ASP.NET in 3.5 Service Pack 1. And then in version 4, we added support for routing, first-class support for routing for web pages, for web forms, I should say. So what I can come and do in here is say, in my global ASAX application start, I'm going to come in and add a route to the route table that goes to an ASPX page. So I'm going to call map page route. I can give this thing a name. It's only used for when I later want to resolve this route from code. I then have to give it the route URL. What type of URL is going to match this route? So for the sake of this demo, I might just call this demo route. And then I want to capture some information from that route, from that URL pattern, so that I can get to that from my route values dictionary in my code behind. So I've used the curly brackets here to say, this is where I want you to capture whatever the user puts inside this URL here. And then it needs to know, well, what file, what actual ASPX file do you want to show when this route is hit? So I've got one here called routing.aspx. Make sure that builds. I'm going to jump over into my routing ASPX page, and I'm just going to drag on some stuff here to show a value that is coming through from the route. So let's format that. I'm going to jump into the code behind here. I'm going to add some code to populate that value so that we can see it. So if I come in here now, come back down to this one here, and put this one in here. Oops, click that properly. Okay. Move that up. So all I've done here is add a property to my code behind called route ID, and the return value for this is me going into the route data collection, which is on my page, looking for the values that map to ID, which has matched what we put in our global ASAX before. If there's nothing there, I'm going to return none. If there is, I'm just going to return toString that. So that all builds. So let's go ahead and run that up and see what that looks like. So if I go to my routing page to begin with, you can see that there's no routing value here because I've actually navigated directly to the page. That's not what's interesting. What we want to do is route to here using, or come to here using that demo route that we set up. So if I come in here and put demo route 100, you can see I'm on the same page, and the value here is indeed 100. And of course, I could keep changing that, and that value is going to flow through. So if you're not using routing today in web forms, I encourage you to have a look if you're interested in being able to control your URLs separately to the name of your ASPX files. It's a really nice way of doing that. So one of the other things I wanted to point out was something called subclassing and tag mapping. Who has used tag mapping in web forms before? Nobody. Okay. So what tag mapping lets you do is say that you want to use a built-in control in ASP.NET, but there's some aspect of the control that you always have to set up. Perhaps you always set the CSS class to some value, or you always initialize some properties a particular way, and you're kind of annoyed that you have to do this over and over and over again every time you use the control. Or perhaps there's some other aspect of the behavior of the control that you want to change and use forevermore from that point on. Well, in .NET 2, we actually introduced a really nice way of being able to do this. So up here, I have a controls folder, and inside it, I have a label. This is my label. It just derives from the standard system.web.ui.webcontrols.label. So there's nothing stopping me as a developer who uses ASP.NET from inheriting from one of the server controls, be it grid view or text box or label or whatever it might be, and then making changes to that so that it always works a certain way. In this case, for the sake of a demo, I'm just overriding the on init, and then I'm going to go ahead and set the text to something so that you can see that this is working, and I'm going to set the CSS class, which is perhaps something that you would do more often. Perhaps you want all your text boxes to have a CSS class of text box or something like that so that you can easily style them. So now that I have this control, if I jump into my web.config file, I need to add a bit of setup for ASP.NET to know how to use that when it sees a label. So if I go into the pages section of my system.web, you'll see I've added a section called tag mapping. So if I jump into my toolbox here, I'm going to pull over some canned code again and remove the duplicates. And all I have to do here is basically put in a mapping between one control and another. So I'm saying whenever you come across the tag of type system.web.ui.webcontrols.label, so the built-in label control, I want you to go ahead and use and map it to this label instead, my web application 1.controls.mylabel. Now, there is a restriction that these things have to be related. The one on the right must derive from the one on the left. You can't arbitrarily replace it with some other control completely. It must derive from that control. So if I go back now and have a look at my tag mapping page, you can see that I have a label in here, indeed. And first of all, we'll actually run it up with this commented out. So I'm just going to comment this out. We'll come back here and run this page up, and you'll see that we should see nothing because a label by default will show nothing. And indeed, we don't. And so then if I come back here and uncomment this line now and hit F5, what we should see is my tag mapped label is now being used in place of the regular ASP.NET label. So if you've ever had to subclass a control, or even if you haven't got that far, you've always manually set properties on controls or manually handled events, and you do it all the time, the same way on the same control, I encourage you to have a look at this because it's a really nice way of not having to repeat yourself over and over and over again. There's a lot of other great stuff we did in version 4. Who uses dynamic data in ASP.NET? Anyone? Okay, a few people. Dynamic data is a really, really cool feature. The big thing to take away from version 4 is dynamic data is not all or nothing. You don't have to start with a dynamic data project, and all your pages don't need to be dynamic data type pages. You can have a regular grid view and then enable some dynamic data goodness on it so that it will be able to do extra things that a normal grid view can't. Similarly, you can use things like the dynamic control in order to get field templates, the benefit of field templates, into your pages so that you don't have to always go label, text box, required field validator, et cetera, if all that stuff is on your model anyway. If you've decorated it with data annotations, then we'll automatically gen that stuff out for you. Or you can indeed copy the field templates into your project and customize those to your heart content. So up on our Coplex site, we have a whole section on dynamic data, including all of the stuff we did in version 4. And a sample project here that you can look at to sort of introduce you to a lot of the new features that were introduced in version 4. Something else I wanted to say is that I mentioned before, the ecosystem of web forms isn't dying. Like, even though it may not be getting the attention that it once did because we have other technologies now as well, we have partners that are still doing wonderful things on web forms. I want to make a call out to DevExpress, who are here, along with a bunch of our other partners like Telerik and Component One and Component Art and Infragistics, who make wonderful, wonderful controls and components for web forms. This is a little video of a new control that they're going to be releasing very, very soon, which you can see is an extremely feature-rich grid control, giving you things like drag and drop grouping, full AJAX capabilities, support for millions of rows. And so I just wanted to make sure that people were aware that these types of things are still happening. If you're interested in these types of usable widgets, components that you can just drop into your application and get this type of rich functionality, I encourage you to go and talk to these partners while you're here at TechEd because they're all down there in the expo hall. Also, if you're interested in things like separation of concerns, if you're more of a coding person, you like testing, you like separation of concerns, you like inversion of control, dependency injection, those type of things, and you're frustrated with perhaps some of the factors that makes it hard about web forms to do those things, then I will point you to this open source project called Web Forms MVP. So MVP stands for Model View Presenter. It is a presentational architecture pattern similar to Model View Controller, but rotated slightly. MVP is a much better fit for UI frameworks that have rich functionality like widgets, like Web Forms does. You drag a grid view on or you type out the grid view syntax and you get a rich, fully featured control when you set a few properties on it. MVP is very, very well structured to deal with that type of UI framework. So what Web Forms MVP will give you in particular is a foundation framework that lets you continue to use the standard Web Forms controls, user controls pages, grid views, all those type of things, the normal data binding, but have a framework behind it that lets you separate out most of your presentation logic into a presenter class. You'll still have access to the HTTP context, request response, caching, session, all those type of things, but you get access to them in an abstracted way through the system.web.abstractions assembly that was released in .NET 3.5 Service Pack 1 to support MVC. So you can test your presenters, and you can even test to make sure that they do things like, if I send this input, make sure that it redirects me to this other page. Because the abstractions that we're giving you for request and response can be tested. They're abstractions. They have virtual members, and you can easily mock those with a mocking framework. So I encourage you to check this out. I'm actually one of the administrators on this project. It's an Outer Curve Foundation project. Who's heard of the Outer Curve Foundation? This is Microsoft's, it was Microsoft's. We started it, but it's now a completely separate entity, open source foundation for promoting open source. It's not just Microsoft stuff, but if we go up to have a look at outercurve.org, this is the Outer Curve Foundation. It's organized into a series of galleries, and you'll see that there's an ASP.NET open source gallery. There are projects in here like Orchard, the content management system that Microsoft is building as an open source project. The ASP.NET Ajax library, which I'll give an update on tomorrow. Things like even like NuGet are an official Outer Curve project. They're not actually owned by Microsoft. And then similarly, the Web Forms MVP project that I just showed you is also in there as well. So if you're interested in that type of thing, I certainly encourage you to check that out. So just jumping back to the slides for a moment. I wanted to say that code-loving Web Forms developers do exist. It's not all drag and drop. It's not all component-driven design. There are plenty of developers who like to write code who live very happily in the Web Forms world. And some of those things I just showed you, like Web Forms MVP, some of the changes we made in 4.0, hopefully have made it easier for those type of developers. And I'm going to show you some stuff coming in the next version that sort of extends on that as well. How do I use web forms, but perhaps use it with a more code-centric approach to things like business logic and data access so that I'm not using so much magic under the hood all the time and perhaps not have that control. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff to talk about in the next version. I'm going to start out with probably our biggest area of improvement, which is data binding. So I'm going to make an assumption that everybody here is using data binding today in web forms. Am I correct? Is anyone not using data binding at all? Okay, so everyone uses data binding. Good. We made a bunch of changes in version 2, all the way back in 2005, that introduced two-way data binding. This was the idea of having the bind expression, where you could literally type bind and then a parenthesis, and then put in a string of a name of your property that you wanted to bind to, and then you would get two-way data binding as long as you were using one of the data source controls that shipped in the box, like the SQL data source or the object data source. Who uses two-way data binding in their applications? That's what I thought. Very, very few people. So there were a few problems with the two-way data binding model. And I'll go into those a little bit in a moment. So some of the things that we are doing, some small things, HTML encoded data binding expressions. So in version 4, we introduced the angle bracket %:, which auto-encodes a response right out to the page. Well, we have the same thing for data binding now. So we have angle bracket %# data binding expression, : which will now server HTML encode your output. We have this idea of strongly typed data controls. So if I have a repeater, I can now tell the repeater that the type of object it's binding against is a customer object, for instance. And then I no longer have to use these eval reflection calls to get that information out. I can get a nice, strongly typed experience at both the design time and runtime to get the information out of those customers. This gives you IntelliSense for data binding expressions, which we'll see in a moment. And also, you can do this with both the one-way and the two-way data binding model. The other huge improvement is something called model binders. Who's familiar with model binders from MVC? Okay, only a couple of people. So model binders are essentially classes that know how to turn user input from a web request specifically, user input into some type, some .NET type, whether it's a string or an integer or some complex type like your customer object. And out of the box, there are a whole bunch of model binders that know how to take input from the form or the query string or cookies or session state or view state and then turn those into any .NET type that you ask it to bind to. And that includes complex types as well. So if your customer object has an address field and the address property is a complex type itself, and that itself has a city property and a street address and things like that, model binding knows how to traverse those types of hierarchies. This was something that you couldn't do with two-way data binding in ASP.NET previously. And it's actually built on top of the extensible model binding infrastructure that comes directly from MVC3 futures. And that's a really interesting point, because as I said, while we may appear to be talking a lot about MVC, there's a reason for that. MVC ships out of band where it enables us to rev it a lot more frequently, whereas WebForms ships in the .NET framework. So we really only ship when .NET ships, although we're hoping to try and bring more stuff out of band to ensure that we can deliver value between cycles like that. But the point is that we can get a lot from MVC. A lot of this great work that we've done in MVC, we're looking to pull back into WebForms where it makes sense. And model binders is one of those things. Just like dynamic data was a concept that it started in WebForms and then was very much heavily influenced the way that MVC works with its field templates. They're basically the same thing. This time it's coming back from MVC into WebForms. So let's have a look at these data binding improvements. Okay, so I'm going to jump back into my page. Let's close a bunch of stuff. So just have a quick recap of how this worked in 2.0 so we can do a comparison. So I have a data-bound form view here. This is how I would do it in 2.0 today. I have a form view control, and then if I scroll down, I have an object data source control. And so I have these two things that always have to be together. I always have to have my data control and the data source that it reads from. The object data source is the one that lets me say, hey, go and get your data from this method on this other class. Or when you want to update, please take the data the user input and shove it into the parameters in this method on this other class. So in this case, I'm saying, well, my type name is my customer repository. So if I go into my model folder here, I have a customer repository. And this is the standard sort of thing you have. It's just a class that talks to your data access layer. So it talks to SQL, or in this case, it's talking to Entity Framework to do your database operations. This used to demo really well because we could hit F7 and say, look, there's no code. The only code that exists is the code that's in your repository or in your class. But the problem with this is that it had a lot of limitations and it fell down very, very quickly. First of all, it would only let you bind. We can see that two-way binding expression up here that I spoke about previously. This bind only worked for simple properties. It only worked to one level deep on your object. And very few object domains generally have objects that only have one level of properties on them. The second problem was that as soon as something went wrong, as soon as you wanted to do anything that was custom in your business layer, in your repository, and you needed to communicate that information back to the page that was calling this, you were in a bit of a pickle because you didn't have the context of the page inside your repository class here. You just knew, all you knew was that your method was being called. So the only way to get information back to the page was by doing things like this, throwing exceptions, typed exceptions, ones that you knew about. You would generally create your own typed exception to represent this behavior. You would throw that, and then back in your page, you would actually end up having to write some code. So if I hid it down here so you wouldn't see it, you would have to go and handle an event on the data binding control, in this case the form view, and like do a bunch of guff to figure out what exception was it? Is it one I know about? If it is, then keep the thing in edit mode, tell it that I handled the exception, and then go and show the message on the page somewhere. So this demo really fell down very, very quickly when you started using it in anger. So what have we done to improve this? Well, let's forget about all of that, and let's have a look at how this is done in model binding. So I'm going to start with the grid view. So let's throw a grid view onto this page. Actually, let's start with a repeater. That's a good way of showing this off first. I'm going to go to this page and show off the strongly typed controls first. So I mentioned this idea of a strongly typed data control. So here I have a standard repeater, and I've set this property over here called model type, which I'll bring to the next line. And I'm telling it what's the type, what's the class that you're binding to when you call data bind on this thing. And I'm telling it it's a product. If I go into the code behind for this, I can add my standard sort of data binding code in here. Let's do that. Find where my code sample is. Okay, so this is just newing up an entity framework context, setting the data source to the result of my products table, and then calling data bind. So what are some of the benefits of doing this? If I come back into here, you'll see that I'm using this item syntax to get to my data item for data binding. And you'll note that if I hover over this, I'm actually getting quick info. I'm getting information because this is strongly typed, and because the editor is hooked up, I can get IntelliSense now directly on the item that I'm binding to. So this is obviously a much nicer experience as far as coding is concerned. And if I go ahead and run that up now, obviously we're going to see something fairly boring, which is a list of products, but the way I did that is kind of interesting because now I get this strongly typed operation. So that's strongly typed controls. Let's jump into model binding, which is related, but you don't actually have to use to get the two together if you don't want to. So I'm going to start with a grid view. Let me find a grid view here. Yep, that one looks like a grid view. Awesome. And it's been gracious enough to format all my properties so that you can't see them. So same thing again. I have a grid view called categories grid. I've set the model type to category because I know what type I'm going to be binding against, so this kind of helps me out. I'm going to say don't auto-generate my columns, and I have to tell it what the data key name is. It's all the standard web forms grid view stuff. The new thing is this thing down here. Telling the grid view directly where do you want me to get the data from. In this case, I've set the select method property equal to something called getCategories. And getCategories is just the name of a method that I'm about to write that is going to get the categories from the database to show on this page. So I'm going to go to my code behind. I just hit F7. You'll see that I've already got my entity framework context being newed up here. So what I need to do now is write a method that matches that getMethods name that I set in here, getCategories, sorry, to return the categories for this. So if I come in here, and actually I think I have to write this one myself, which is fine. So I'm going to say a public IEnumerable of category, getCategories. And what I want to do is return db.categories. That's probably good enough. That's all I need to do in this case. Let's run that up, see what it does. Okay, so that was easy. I've set it up. I told it what method I wanted it to use to get my information. And now I've got my information. That's fairly straightforward. So next thing I want to do is go ahead and add a different type of column to this. What about if I want to add a column that has the count of the number of products associated with this category? Now, I'm binding directly to the category. So what I'm going to do is say I'm going to add a template field, template column, sorry. Template field, no, that was right. And I'm going to set the item template of this, not the item style, the item template. And in here, I'm just going to omit item. So again, I'm getting that strongly typed experience, item.products.count. So I want to echo out the count. So I'm going to give this a header so we can see it. Header text equals a number of products. Okay, so let's go back, hit F5, see what we get. Okay, so now I have the number of products per category. That's kind of cool. But anyone who's used EF will know that what I've done now is kind of bad. Anyone know what I did? No? I've created myself an n+1 situation. If I fire up SQL Profiler, and we start a new profile, let's have a look at what this is actually doing under the hoods. So So let's connect. So I'm listening on my SQL Express database now. Let's just clear out everything that's there. Let's go back to my page. Find it in this nest. Here it is. Let's put SQL Profiler over here. Let's clear this out. Snap that there. I'm going to refresh this page. Okay, so reload. Wow, that's a lot of SQL that just happened for my little, showing the table of stuff. And you can see here, if I just arrow down through these, the only thing that's changing in between these things is this value down here, entity key value 1. So this is called an n+1 problem. What I've done is I had one database query to get me the first 3 columns of information, and then for every row, I've gone off and got the count as a separate query. Not really optimal, I should say. So what I'm going to do here is just do a bit of EF magic to tell it to go ahead and to eagerly load that information in the first query. So I'm going to say include categories such that category.products. So now it knows that it wants to also load the products when I initially execute this query. So if I clear this out this time and go back to this, I'm going to reload that, let it build. I'm going to clear this out again, and do that here to get rid of all that. And what we'll see this time is that we only have one query. The batch started and the batch completed. And so now in a single query, I was able to get out all the information that I needed to show these columns on the page. So that's kind of an interesting thing there as well. So now that I have this information on my page, let's go ahead and add a few other features of my grid view and look at how they work with model binding. So I want to now filter this grid view by some other value that the user will input. So first of all, let's set it up to filter by query string. Now, if you were using data binding previously with a data source, what you would do is go into the markup, you would find your data source, or you would use the designer, and you would add a select parameter, and it would be of type query string parameter, and you would set a whole bunch of values on that, and then that you would have to update your query, obviously, to work with that. Well, it's much, much simpler when we're using data binding, model binding, I should say. So I already have my getCategories method, and I want to filter by some ID or some element. In this case, what I want to do is filter by the number of products. So I'm going to just add a parameter. So it's going to be a nullable int, min products count. Okay, so now I only want to, if this is supplied, because it's nullable, if it is supplied, I want to ensure that I only return categories that have the minimum product amount or more. So I'm going to change this code a bit. I'm going to store this query in a variable, and then I'm going to return the query here. So now that I have that query as a variable that I can edit, I can now conditionally add this where clause. So I can say, well, if min products count dot has a value, I can say query is equal to query.where category such that category.products.count is greater than or equal to my min products count. Okay, so just a little bit of code. Again, nothing wrong with writing code. Code is good. I like writing code. Using EF and link code is even better. And so now I go, okay, well, where is this going to come from? Min products count. At the moment, it's just a parameter on my method. I have to tell the model binding system where I want this value to come from. Well, I can do that by adding an attribute to the beginning of this parameter. And I'm going to use the query string attribute. So now I'm saying, hey, when you go to call the getCategories method, I want you to look in the query string for min products count. And if there is a value, I want you to automatically convert it into an int for me. And if it can't be converted into an int, just leave it as null. So this is the type of code today that web forms and ASP.NET developers have to write over and over and over again. Was the value in the query string collection? If it was, try and parse it into some value. What happens if it doesn't parse into that value? You have to handle all those situations yourself. This is where model binding really comes into its own. So let's go and run this page up again. Okay, so nothing's changed so far. I'm going to go up into the query string. I'm going to say min products count equals 10. And then what we'll see is that, okay, one of them dropped off. Let's say min products count equals 12. We'll see that, okay, another one dropped off. And if I put up to 15, we should see that we get none. Okay? So again, very, very simply, I've been able to now add some filtering from the query string for my grid view now that I'm using model binding. And if I wanted to clean this up a bit, I could come in here and I could add an empty data template. And I could say something like, no categories found with a product count of, and then I could echo out what that is. But coming from the query string is kind of, yeah, that's okay, you might want to do that. But a lot of the time in web forms, we want to come from some other control. So how about we drag another control in here, and then we set this up to work with a different control. So let me find my control so I don't have to type it up. Or maybe I do have to type it up. I can never remember which bits I pre-can and which bits I just say to myself, no, you're going to have to type that up. And I think in this case I said to myself, no, you're going to have to type that up. So what I'm going to have to do here is I want to drop down list. When I equal server, I'm going to give it an ID of min product count. And I'm just going to put some values in here. Just hard code them. ASP list item, value equals 5. Actually, I'll put a blank one in to begin with. Text equals that. So that's going to be my default one because it's first. ASP list item, text equals 5. Same again, ASP list item, text equals 10. And we'll do another one last one. Text equals 15. Okay, so now I have a control on the page that is named that same thing that I have in my parameter in my code behind. So I'm going to come in here and change it from query string to control. I want you to get this value from another control on my page. Rebuild that, make sure it builds. I'll just put a label in front of this so we can see it. Okay, come back up here, reload the page. Okay, so now I've got select min products count currently set to 0. If I hit 5, and the other thing I have to do is set some properties on this, obviously, to tell it to post back. So I'm going to say auto post back to true. So now that when it changes, it's going to do a post back for me. And then at the moment in this build that I'm using, because what I didn't tell you is that the build that I'm using here of Visual Studio and of web forms is literally 1 day old. I got emailed like some new binaries by one of the testers yesterday morning, and I sort of gacked them into my machine. So some things still don't quite work yet, but they will work, obviously, when we ship. So there's one other thing I need to do here to make this work at the moment, which is to add some event handlers to do with rebinding. Now, you won't have to do this in the release. We will detect if these values change in the final release, but at the moment, I have to add these handlers in here so that it knows when it changes. Okay, so now if I change this to, say, 10, you'll see that I'm getting the same behavior I was before, but now it's binding to my category, to my drop-down list instead of binding to the query string. So that's kind of nice. Okay, so now that I've got some filtering, how about we go and look at, just a quick thing. These attributes here, we call these value provider attributes. Where is my value going to come from? So I showed you query string and control, but we also support coming directly from the form collection. So if you don't want to use server controls, you just want to use basic HTML elements for certain things, you can just do that, say form. You can also come directly from a cookie. So if you have some information stored in a cookie and you want that to come in, you can do that very simply there. You can come from view state. If you're pushing stuff into view state with a key that you know about, you can do that. And we'll also support session, route data, and the profile system as well. And you can write your own. This is completely extensible. These are just standard attributes that match a particular interface. So you can write those, you could use those, and then we would know how to get the value out of those. And that's a very good point, because perhaps I wanted to do something like query string and then look in a cookie. I can absolutely do that. Yes, there's a question. So the question is, can you do multiple parameters? You absolutely can, yes. So the way model binding works is that when it calls this method, it looks at all the parameters in the signature of the method, and then it goes through each parameter and says, try and put a value into this parameter. And if you have an attribute in there, then you're giving information about where to get that value from. So you can absolutely do that. Now, if you wanted to do something complex, like first look in the query string and then look in a cookie, you can very simply write your own attribute class that basically collates the two attributes that are in the system already. We call it a composite. Say, well, look in the query string. If there's no value in there, then look in the cookie. And you can write that in about 15 lines of code, and then you have that custom logic that always does that. Again, this is the type of thing that as a web forms developer today, you would have to write that 5 to 10 lines of code in the top of the method, and you would do it over and over and over again, because ultimately when you're working with the web, everything coming in is text. Everything coming in is a string, and you have to do all the work to turn it into what it is that makes it actually useful, and handle when it can't be turned into that. So model binding is very much about taking away a lot of that repetitive monkey code, as we call it. That's an excellent question, sir. The question is, can you control the ID of the control? So by default, it's going to use the parameter name, but you can absolutely come in here and use the default constructor and pass in, say you wanted to use Hungarian notation, you were doing DDL products count, you could do that.
and now it's going to go ahead and look for a control of that name instead. So you can certainly do that. Any questions on that before I move on? Yes? Can you pass in a whole object? Yes, you can. And we're going to look at that in just a moment to do with the update scenario. So yes, model binding will look at the type of the parameter. In this case, it's an int, so it's kind of easy. But if the type was some complex type, it will attempt to bind that using the rules built in or some custom logic that you can apply. So let's go and and start looking at some of these more advanced scenarios above select now, because it looks like people are interested. Well, first of all, let's add paging and sorting, because that's kind of cool. So let's go back in. I'm going to enable paging and sorting on my grid. So I'm going to say allow sorting equals true, and allow paging equals true. Okay, I'm going to go back and refresh my page, and what I should get is a big fat error. Okay, so it's saying when you have paging enabled, the select method needs to either return an iQueryable or take a whole bunch of parameters so that you can do the paging yourself. Well, I don't feel like doing that, so I'm just going to return an iQueryable and see what it does. So let's go back into here. Luckily, I'm actually already working with an iQueryable because I'm working with Entity Framework. So it is a link query provider. So I'm going to just change this from IEnumerable to iQueryable and rebuild that. Okay, that builds. That's great. Let's come back into my page. Hit the backspace, hit reload. Okay, so now I'm getting another error because I'm using EF, and it's saying, well, you can't start doing paging on this until you've ordered it by something. So, okay, well, let's go and do that. So here, I'm going to say return the query, but by default, I want you to order by category such that category.category ID, which I know is my primary key, so it's clustered, so it's going to be fine, nice and quick for doing any type of ordering information. So let me refresh that. Okay, so now I'm not getting an error anymore. You can see that my columns are sortable. But I'm still not getting any pages because I haven't actually adjusted my page size. So let's go back into here, set my page size down to something like 5. Now if I hit refresh, now you can see I'm actually getting my paging and my sorting information for me for free just because I returned iQueryable. So again, this comes back to if you're using data access techniques that are code-focused, you're using Entity Framework or Link to SQL or Hibernate with a link provider, then we've built model binding to work for those systems. So that if you're working by building up link queries and you have this iQueryable just ready to be inspected and worked on, you can just give that to us now. We know how to do paging with an iQueryable. We know how to do filtering with an iQueryable. We will do that for you automatically so you don't have to write that code, which is kind of nice. Now, if you do want to write that code, or you're doing something a little bit tricky, say I wanted to enable sorting by this number of products column. Okay, well, we can't do that with an iQueryable directly because the sort expression doesn't map to a property on the thing we're binding to. So you can flip back to using an IEnumerable and then take in those parameters, that start row index, the max rows, and the sort expression. And then you can take those parameters into your model method, and then you can do the sorting and ordering yourself if you want to do that, the sorting and paging, I should say. Okay, so that's paging and sorting with an iQueryable. Very cool, very cool. Let's go ahead now and add a related grid. So I've got my categories grid. I want to go ahead and show a products grid underneath that so that when I select something from my categories grid, I can see the related products. So it's sort of classic master detail sort of information. So here's my categories grid. That's the code. I want to see the grid itself. That would be my categories grid. There it is. It's my products grid. Okay. So again, it's just a standard grid view, nothing particularly special, except that I'm now specifying the model type as product, and I'm selecting, setting my select method equal to get products. So I have to go back into my code behind, add a new method that's going to return this information. So I do have one of those. I just saw it a moment ago. Products grid, here it is. Note how I tend to comment the top of my methods here, telling it where it came from, like what's going to be calling this. In this case, the grid view called products grid is going to be calling the select method, just so that I know. If you use MVC, you'll see that a lot of the times a convention people use in MVC is their action methods. They comment above it what route, what URL will be used to come into this action method. So it's kind of a nice reminder. So in this case, you can see that I'm using the value provider control that you saw before. So I want to get the value for the category ID parameter from my categories grid. So you can see this is an example where I have the parameter name is different to the control name of the value provider coming in. And then I'm just saying return products where the category ID is equal to that category. Now again, I have to uncomment a line up here to fire this event and force rebinding. In the release, you won't need to do that. We will do that for you automatically. So if I go back and run this page again, reload, by default, and the other thing I need to do is enable selection. So I'm going to come back into here and say auto-generate select button equal to true. Okay, so now I can actually select things on my grid. And if I go ahead and select these things now, you can see I'm getting the related products for those directly underneath. And again, this is something that we've been able to do this since .NET 2, but you had to either use the designer or write a whole bunch of markup to do this, or write a whole bunch of code to do it yourself. Hopefully what you're seeing here is that a lot less markup and a lot more normal-looking code. It's not web forms code, it's just data access code. And I'm just returning an iQueryable, and then everything just starts to work nicely. Okay, so now I have master details. Let's go and add update support so that I can actually look at updating these things and look how model binding works with that. So let me go ahead and let me auto-generate my edit button. True. And let me tell it what method I want it to use for updates. So I'm going to set the update method equal to update category. Okay, go into my code behind now. I have to add another method. Let's find my update. Categories. I think it's that one. Nope. This one. Okay. So actually, we'll do this by hand to start with, because that's a lot of stuff in there. So I've got my update category. We don't need this timestamp column just yet. And what I can do straight off the bat is I can say, well, let's just take in the category. Let me just do this. And I'll put a F breakpoint down. I'm going to hit F5. Let's start debug so we can have a look at what's going on here. Go back to the page. It's going to be complaining. Let me reload it this way. Make sure my breakpoint, is attached. So let me flip this into edit mode. I'm going to make a change, hit update, and my breakpoint has been hit. Okay, that's good. It's a good start. It's coming into my code. Let's have a look at this category parameter that I put in my update method. We can explode this out. We'll zoom in here a bit. Wait for my machine to catch up. Maybe we can use the watch window. Ooh, dear. Oh, there we go. Oh, no. I lost my... What have I lost? Let's run that through again. Edit. Update. Okay, there we go. The debug visualizer is back. Okay, so we can see here that here's the value that I entered. So it was beverages 6, and now it's beverages. And here's the description as it was, and the category ID, that's fine. But you'll see that the products has been nulled out. Oh, that's a bit odd. I know that there are products associated with beverages, but the category I'm being given has no products on it. Well, and that's because what's happened is the model binding system has said, well, you have a parameter on this method of type category. I'm going to attempt to build you a category from the information that I have from that grid view. And the information you have from that grid view is governed purely by the data binding expressions that you set up. So if we go back and have a look, all of these bound fields will implicitly set up a data binding expression, a two-way relationship, in this case between the category ID, the category name, and the description field. So it's attempted to bind all that information in, which it did, but when it got to the products property, it went, well, I have no information to that, and so it had nothing to put on there. So this is a very important point, is that while you certainly can do this, you can take a category and we will bind it in, most of the time you won't. Most of the time your objects are suitably complex that you don't send all the information down to the browser in view state or in the form and then expect it all to be posted back again. You just send down the bits that you want the user to be able to see or edit. So instead of taking the whole category in, I'm going to take in the category ID, and then I'm going to look up the category from the database. So I'm going to say var category equals mydb.categories.find by category ID. And then, now that I have the category, I'm now going to push these values onto it using model binding. And I do that using the try update model method that now exists on the page class. So I have my category, and I'm going to say try update model. So I'm going to put a breakpoint on here. And let's run that up again, and we'll see just slightly how this differs. Come back, cancel that, reload that. Okay, let's edit this. I'm going to change it from beverages 6 to beverages. I'm going to hit update. Okay, so my category has been loaded from the database. If I open this up, you can see the category name here is beverages 6. If you can see that, come down here, we'll look at it in the locals window. It's a bit easier. So beverages 6 has been loaded from the database. And now I'm going to say, okay, update this model. So I'm going to hit F10 to step over that. And now if we can see that beverages is now red, it got changed. But the products collection still exists because I loaded it from the database. It knows it has 12 products. And then I've just said, update this model, this class, this object, update it with the information that you have from the grid view in order to do that. And so now I can go ahead and obviously save that back to the database. So let's do that. So I can get rid of this breakpoint. We'll say, okay, now that I have this, db.save changes. Nice and simple. Come back into here. Let's reload this. Edit. Change it to beverages 100. Update. And you can see this now, beverages 100. If I reload this, it's still beverages 100. So very, very simple using EF. This is EF code first. It's the Entity Framework 4.1, otherwise known as Magic Unicorn Edition. To do this, and then model binding to make it really easy to get the information in and out again. So that's update model. Let's have a look at adding some validation. So as web forms developers, we're used to using server controls to perform our validation, and you absolutely still can do that, and it's totally valid to do that with model binding. But we also now get an extra layer of validation that we can leverage, which is this thing called data annotations. Who has used data annotations before? Okay, so if you've done RIA services in Silverlight, or you've done dynamic data, or you've used MVC, you will have used data annotations. So let me open my category model. This is the class that I have that represents a category from the Northwind database. And I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to annotate one of these properties with a bit of extra information. If I open up my database and actually have a look at my category name field, we'll see that it's actually set to nvarchar 15. So it actually only takes 15 characters. Currently, my model doesn't support that. I have no validation that says that. So if I try to put something in that's greater than 15 characters, what's going to happen? Let's have a look. We're going to get a beautifully friendly, I imagine, let's just say, hey, let's do something like this, update. Okay, so we get an error from the database, which is what we expect because, hey, it says it's not going to take that. So let's add some nice stuff in here so I don't have to let it go all the way back to the database to do that. So I'm going to say string length of this property using an annotation, an attribute, is 15. Okay, let's rebuild that. Let's do the same thing again. Come back to here. See how it fails this time. Reload, edit, update. Wow, same thing happened. Why? Because I haven't told it to ignore, to actually look for these model errors. So let's come back into my code. Here's my update method. After I've updated the model, I now have to inspect the state of the model to figure out whether any errors occurred during the update operation. So now I'm going to say if model state.is valid, then it's safe to go off and save the changes to the database. So now that I've done that, let's come back, go back, hit reload, do it again, take that, update, and this time it didn't blow up, but I'm not seeing anything telling me that the thing happened. Now you'll see that it's still showing beverages 100, 100, 100, and the reason that is because I updated that entity in my database context, and I never told it to save changes, and then the grid view rebound to the same context. And so even though the data's not in the database, it's in the context, because I didn't clear it out yet. So let's clear all this up. So I haven't got any information telling me that it didn't work, and it's still looking at the wrong thing. So let's come back in. Let's add a validation summary, standard validation summary that we know and love. And I'm going to set this property, show model state errors equals to true. Okay, so that's good. That should take care of showing me when something's wrong. And then back in here, I'm going to say, well, if it wasn't valid, what I want you to do is go in back into the database for this category entry, and I want you to reload it. Because it's been polluted. What happened is I updated the model with the user data Turns out that wasn't valid, so I've got to reload it again so that I can show the user correct information for this demo. Now, this is another situation where something isn't quite working yet that will be working by the release, which I'll explain a little bit when you see this behavior. So this time I put this information in, I hit update, and you'll see down here, here's my error. The field category name must be a string with a maximum length of 15. That was auto-generated for me from that model binding validation, and beverages 100 has been maintained. Now, what you would actually want in this situation generally is to keep the row in edit mode, right? You want to show the error message and keep the row in the edit mode so the user can update it. That will happen by release. That's a bug that hasn't been fixed yet. So we won't have to worry about doing that reload information because we actually want to show the user's data at that point. Okay, so that's how we do model validation. What about something a little more complicated, like custom model errors? So let's go back into my database and let's add a new restriction on category name. So I've come down here to the category name index. You'll see currently it's non-unique. I'm going to open this up and let's make that unique. Hit OK. Let's refresh that. Not delete. Refresh. OK, that's now unique. So now I should get an error if I try and put two categories in with the same name. Let's just validate that that actually works. Let's reload this. And that's not what I wanted to see. Let's try that again. OK, let's reload that. Edit. Let's take this word from down here, condiments, put that in there, update, and we should see an error because database has said, hey, you can't have this, a unique key violation, blah, 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 and something has gone wrong. So that's all well and good. Let's look at how we would handle that. Let's come back into my code. So now I know my save changes might actually throw an exception. We all do exception handling because we're obviously competent developers. So I'm going to handle my DB update exception. And for the sake of the demo, I'm just going to assume that if it's a DB update exception, it's my unique key violation that's going on. Now, of course, I probably should be looking at the exception data, inspecting the error code from the database, and ensuring that. But for the sake of the demo, we'll just do it this way. So an update exception has occurred. I'm going to go into my model state. I'm going to add a new model error that I want to just add arbitrarily. Give it an empty key because it's not associated with a particular field. Well, I could actually give it the field with the category name, I guess, but we'll just give it a general error in this case. And then we will put in something like string.format category with the name something already exists. And then I will pass in category.category name. So now my error message is customized. That's all kind of good. All right, so hopefully in this case this is all going to work. I should actually reload this from the database. Otherwise, it's going to continue to show the invalid information. Let me reload this. OK, edit. Try and set it to condiments. Update. Aha. So now category with the name condiments already exists. So working with that information that's stored right in the database, that unique key violation, has become fairly straightforward. Again, this is the type of code that as real developers, we write all the time. You generally don't see people demoing this type of code on stage, catching exceptions, throwing model messages in. But the pickup here is that it was extremely easy now to catch a database exception to do with my model and then just push that into this thing called model state. I'm not pushing it onto the page. I'm pushing it into model state, and I'm letting model binding letting web forms take care of showing it on the page for me. Incidentally, this also means that this code is testable. If I want to have this code in a different class, at the moment I'm in the code behind, but I could put this in my own class so that it's not in the page. I can handle one event on the grid view to tell it to use that class instead of the page code behind for the methods. And then everything I've done in here so far is testable. I'm not accessing anything on the page directly. I'm just working with the EF. I'm working with the model state, and you would be given a model state parameter or a static model state member that you can use to do this from another class. So now this code is testable, which is kind of cool, given that we're in web forms. OK, so that's model validation, both annotated and also custom back from the database. I've got about 20 minutes. I can either, I won't do optimistic concurrency. If you do, who does optimistic concurrency in their data access today? So they have a timestamp column or a row version, something like that? Everybody? Okay, so I definitely won't do that demo. There's other stuff that we haven't finished yet that I just want to briefly mention for model binding. You can do model methods on a different class, like I just mentioned. We haven't done that yet. Support for dynamic model type. So at the moment, I'm working with a strongly typed object. I know that I'm working with category and product. But we will be actually supporting being able to put dynamic in here. And then the item down here will be of type dynamic. Then you can give the grid view loosely typed data. You could perhaps use an expression in your link query to project a completely new anonymous type rather than having to traverse through item.products.count. Just have product count as a top level property. And you could do that because the model type will be dynamic. So we're going to add that support. The other thing we're looking at is something called ad hoc model binding. Everything I've showed you so far is to do with using the data controls in web forms. What if you don't want to use those controls? You want all the features of model binding. You want to be able to take all the input from the query string, the cookie, and the form and push it onto something, but you don't want to have to use data objects, the data controls to do that. So we are looking at doing that as well. And the ideas we have at the moment are that you would just be able to call try update model from in here and pass in some model property, whatever it is, some object that you want to be filled. And in this case, it'll do very much what MVC does, and we'll just look at all the input from query string, cookies, forms, everywhere, and attempt to populate everything on that object from those sources. The other idea that we're also playing with is the idea of having a property, and we could just say, we'll just call it that, and then you could decorate this with something like model bind, not that one, model bind, and then again through try update model, that would automatically bind every property on your page that is decorated with the model bind attribute. So we're looking for feedback on that. If you think those things are useful, then by all means, feel free to send me an email or grab me afterwards, and I'll take that feedback back to the team. Okay, let's move off. Any questions on data binding before I move off? Yes? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes? Yep. Okay. Yep. Yep. Yes, is large. So that's an excellent question. The question is, I have a .NET 2.0 ASP.NET app today, so I'm using SQL Data Reader and lots of strings or data sets or whatever to do my retrieval, and the old way of data binding. But this looks great. I want to prepare for it. What can I do right now between like today and when this gets released to prepare myself for this? So definitely move to something like EF 4.1 code first if you're interested in that type of thing. That will save you the code of having to construct a query and then turn the results into some .NET type, some strongly typed class. It'll do that for you. You'll also get the benefits of all the query manipulation using link and those type of things if that's of interest. Now, you don't have to do that. If you're happy using SQL Data Reader and you're happy having SQL embedded in strings in your code, which is perfectly fine as long as you parameterize it, then you can absolutely use that with model binding. But if you like EF, then I would say move to EF first. That would be a good thing to do. Beyond that, not an awful lot. Because once you've done that, the next thing that you'll do is, rather than calling .data source equals something and then .data bind, you'll remove that code. You'll create a method that just returns the data, which will be the stuff that was before .data source and .data bind. And then you'll add a property to your grid view or your form view or whatever you're using to say, hey, here's the method to go and get that information. The update is a little bit more work because you're going to have to create a method, obviously, to do the update as well, but you may have that already. Depending on how you've factored out your code already, you may have patterns that kind of look like this already. So I would say move to EF. If you're not using a data access class already that has, you've created your own class with an update method, a select method, and those type of things, perhaps do that because that will put you in good stead to just then wire that up to model binding when it comes along. I would also go in, if you want to sort of learn more about how model binding works and the underlying infrastructure, it is taken almost directly from MVC, the MVC3 futures. And that code is open source. You can go and have a look at the model binding samples in there. And a lot of the stuff still applies. If you want to write custom model binders, custom value providers, it's all the same infrastructure. Any other questions on data binding? Okay, so let's move in and have a look at some of the other stuff that we've been working on. Async. Who's used the async CTP that was released? Only a couple of hands. So async is a very, very big focus for this next version of .NET that we're working on right now. So we're going to be adding support for a lot of this new async magic in ASP.NET as part of this as well. So the task parallel library, that was released in .NET 4. You can use that today. And that's kind of the precursor to this work that's happening now. And then there are new keywords coming in the next version of C# and Visual Basic that will enable you to write asynchronous applications that use the task parallel library in a very, very nice way. It almost looks synchronous. Basically, compile a magic that knows when you're dealing with an asynchronous API and will automatically split things out into begin and end for you and wire them all up again at the right time. So we're adding new APIs to async pages and handlers so that you can write these things a little bit easier yourself. And the very important thing to keep in mind is that async in web forms, particularly, or in ASP.NET, is good for a couple of scenarios. One is if you're doing any type of I/O, any type of query off the box, or even on the box, anything to a file, anything to a database, anything to a web service, anything over the network, anything to do with I/O, then you can do that asynchronously using the specific asynchronous I/O methods that those classes in .NET give you. What that gives you is that while that operation is taking place, ASP.NET is not using a thread to serve that request anymore. That request gets parked, the thread goes away, the database operation occurs, and then when the database operation completes and the page gets to that point in the lifecycle, ASP.NET will find a new thread, reignite the request, and to the user it just looks like they're making a request, nothing has changed, sync it all up and then send it again. What that means is that you can get potentially better scalability, because the more threads you have available to ASP.NET at any one time, the more requests it can serve at any one time. By default, well, this is how ASP.NET works, every request that comes in gets a thread, but there is only a finite amount of threads available. So if you get too many requests at the exact same time, if you have very high load, then you can literally run into the situation where you starve the thread pool and you can no longer serve requests. So asynchronous I/O operations can very much help with that. The other use case for this is if you don't care about scalability, perhaps you don't have lots of concurrent connections, it doesn't matter, but you want to speed up the execution of your page because you're doing multiple things, then asynchronous can help you because you can actually do things in parallel. You can say, fire off these 2 database queries and these 3 web service calls and do them in parallel. And then when they all come back together, then go off and work with the results. Obviously, that's going to save you some time rather than doing 5 I/O calls sequentially. So that's the scenarios that you're going to be using these for. So how does this actually look in the next version? Let's close down our model binding samples, and let's have a look at async. So I have an async page, sample page here. Note that I have my async equals true set to the top of the page. This has pretty much been there forever. You've been able to do async pages in .NET for a very, very long time, but the APIs are kind of clunky. And working with it gets very difficult as soon as you want to do anything more simple than a single operation. So I've got a label here that tells me that I'm going to put in the ID of the thread that the request started on, and then another one that I'm going to put in the ID of the thread that the request finished on, so that you can see that the threads may actually change over time. And then I've got a text box that I'm just going to shove some information into as a result of doing some async work. So I'm going to go to the code behind. First thing I'm going to do is on page load, I'm going to set the starting thread text box text property to the value of the current thread, the ID of the current thread that's running on the request. So this is a thread that started the request. I'm going to add some code here that does some async stuff. So this is a method that is going to read the contents of a file asynchronously. So I'm using the new async keyword in C#. And you can play with the async stuff today, I should say, in the async CTP. This was released in October, and there's been a refresh recently. So in Visual Studio 2010 with Service Pack 1, if you download the async CTP, you can play with the async keyword and the await keyword, the things I'm about to show you here, if you want to prepare for doing this stuff. So it's a method that returns a task This is a .NET 4 type. It's a promise that will eventually result in a string, a task of string. And so then what I'm going to do is new up a stream reader, open up some file, and then this is the magic code right here. I'm going to say set my contents equal to await read to end async. So what actually happens when you run this code is that the first thread will go through this and nothing will get assigned to contents. Because read to end async is asynchronous. It's going to fire off a completely different operation outside the context of this to read the contents of that file. And then when that is finished, the runtime will automatically glue that result back into contents, okay, rather than this line waiting until read to end async has finished. Read to end async will return immediately, and then at some point later, the result will be assigned to contents. But this looks like synchronous code. I haven't had to... Who's done asynchronous programming with the .NET 1.1? Like the begin and the end methods, iasync result? Okay, headache stuff, horrible stuff. Under the covers, this is all kind of doing the same thing, but it's doing it for you. I have a task of string. I say await the end of this asynchronous operation. When that happens, set the result of contents, then do this, and then do that. All compiler magic. Very, very nice. So let's use it. How do I actually go ahead and use it? I've got this method. Let's come in here. Let's do it with one of the 3 APIs that we have. So there are 3 APIs in web forms that you can use for doing asynchronous operations. One is the page async task. This exists today. So I say register async task, new up a page async task, but we have a new overload that takes an asynchronous lambda. So this here is my asynchronous lambda signature. So it takes an object, some arguments, and then a cancellation token. This is a task thing, which I'm not going to talk about today. I mark it with async, so it's an async method. And then inside here, I can write what looks like synchronous code. File contents, which is a text box, .text is equal to await the result of my asynchronous method down here. And I'm going to concatenate it with the awaiting result of a different call, and then a different call again. So I'm actually performing 3 asynchronous operations here. And they're automatically chaining themselves together because I'm using the await keyword and the async keyword and the task parallel library. And then once that's all finished, I'm going to set the value of the end thread text box to the value of the thread that it is now. So let's run this one up and have a look at what this looks like. So look at async. Okay, so what have we got? I'm going to hit F5 a few times so I can force it to go on a different thread. All right, so up the top, we started on thread 28. And then in my text box, I have the contents of those 3 files that I asked it to load. So we have a few things in here. Default, you can see the next page starts here. And then we come down here, and then the next page starts there. So that all worked. And then we finished on thread 26. So the page started on thread 28, and then it finished on thread 26. So those I/O operations where I read the contents of those files, at that point, the thread was not being used at all. There was no thread, as far as ASP.NET is concerned, no thread being used to service the request. And if we go back and have a look at the code again, this is so much easier than what you'd have to write today. If you wanted to chain asynchronous operations together today in ASP.NET, there would be an order of magnitude more code than this. So this is a really, really cool way of doing things. Now, there are 2 other APIs you can use. This is the page async task. You can also use the add, I don't want snip, the add async on pre-render complete. So let's do that. This is this one here. Okay. So we have this method today in ASP.NET, add on pre-render complete async. The reason it's called that is because there's a special point in the lifecycle of an ASP.NET page called the pre-render complete event in the page lifecycle, where all asynchronous operations finish by. If you register any async operations using these methods, then they're guaranteed to be done by that point, or if they're not, then they're going to time out. Okay? So I add on pre-render complete async, and what I'm adding to it is the result of this new type, event handler task async helper, into which I can pass, again, an asynchronous lambda. I do my asynchronous operation, await get file contents async. thread, current thread.manage thread.toString. So I'm doing exactly the same thing I was before. And then I'm just saying add on pre-render complete async, helper.begin event handler, and helper.end event handler. And that's going to do the exact same thing that we saw before. The other API that we can use is a new event signature. So if I don't want to use those two APIs, what I can do, come down in here, toolbox. So you can just add a method, an async method to your page that has a name of page underscore pre-render complete async, takes those three arguments that we saw before, standard event handler arguments and a cancellation token, and then I can just write my asynchronous code. In this case, rather than getting contents from a file, let's go out to Twitter and get some contents from Twitter. So I'm going to come down here, add another method here, get Twitter HTML. So this is using the web client type in .NET. There's a new member, download string task async, which returns a task of string. So I can create an asynchronous method around that. And if we go back up here, I'm just saying await get Twitter HTML, and then when it's finished, go ahead and set the end thread. So if I go back here, hit F5, assuming my internet connection is working, you can see we started on thread 30, we finished on thread 22, and what I have here is the HTML from the homepage of Twitter. Cool. So again, very, very nice way of doing asynchronous I/O operations in the next version of .NET. Okay, so we've also made a bunch of front-end improvements. I've got about 3 minutes left, so I'll just talk through these. One of those is the unobtrusive validators. A whole bunch of work done on MVC3 to clean up the JavaScript used by validation. We're taking that same idea and bringing it into web forms. So by default, with new projects in the next version, you'll be able, we'll have unobtrusive validators turned on. So if you use any of the built-in validators, required field, range validator, those type of things, there will be no inline JavaScript rendered as part of those validators anymore. And those who use those extensively today will know that they actually account for a very large portion of the amount of JavaScript that gets rendered in page. So we get a smaller page size, which means faster loading and better caching because it's just a single external JavaScript file now that contains all that information that was previously being rendered inline. And it leverages jQuery. So the first time, web forms doesn't just ship jQuery in the box. It actually relies on jQuery to do some of its features, in this case, unobtrusive validators. Anti-XSS, who's using the anti-XSS library from the Patterns and Practices group today? Anybody? A couple of hands. So happy to announce that that will be baked into the next version of web forms, ASP.NET in general, I should say. You'll be able to turn it on, and then any server encoding that you do via the standard mechanisms, whether it's the HTTP utility or angle bracket %, will use that method. And so you get better cross-site scripting protection. We're doing a bunch of updates around HTML5, let you use some of the new input types, email, calendar, those type of things, as long as your browser supports them. The only browser that really supports them well today is Opera, but I'm sure that will change. Also, things like multiple file upload. Things like Chrome and Firefox will enable you to have a file control that you can add more than one file to, so we'll support that with the file upload control in the next version. And then a really big feature, which is runtime combination and minification of JavaScript and CSS files. So if you're doing any type of combining and minification of your JavaScript today, which you should be doing for optimization, you'll be generally doing it as a build step, a part of deployment. Well, you'll be able to do that directly in the box in the next version. We have runtime support for that. So you can just say, script source equals my script folder /JS. And then the JS suffix tells ASP.NET, hey, what I'm going to do is look at all the JavaScript files in the folder, minimize them by stripping out all the comments in the white space, and then combine them into a single file for you. And then when it returns the result, it'll make sure it's gzip compressed, and that it sets a long expiration header, about 1 year, on that result, so you get much better caching performance. So as a summary, web forms is most definitely not dead. We are doing a lot of work on web forms for the next version of .NET. The biggest improvements are around data binding, using the strongly typed data controls, and the model binders. There's also a bunch of editor improvements, which I didn't show you. Things like getting IntelliSense for those expressions inside HTML attributes now. You'll know today if you try and use a data binding expression or response writing expression inside an attribute, you get no IntelliSense. You will in the next version. Easier asynchronous programming model for that better scalability if you're doing that type of coding. And also better support in our front-end work for HTML5, the anti-XSS work, and the JavaScript and CSS combination and unobtrusive validators. There's some related sessions here that might be of interest to you. One of them was on yesterday, but you could obviously watch that online if you didn't get to see it. And there is a hands-on lab that introduces you to Web Forms 4, so the stuff that we released last April that I started out the talk with. If you haven't had a good look at that yet, go and check out that hands-on lab to get a bit of an overview. There's some WebTrack resources here. Thank you very much for your time. Please fill in your evals. I will be down in the Technical Learning Center at about 10:15, 10:30 today. If you have any more questions, or just grab me now. Thanks for coming along, and have a great tech ed. Cheers.